Hey everyone, so I'm going to kick things off next, and just as a side note, it looks like Remo is working, so feel free to log in there in between the sessions, or if you want to drop off and go to Remo and speak with our team as well. We are available and it's working there now. So this presentation is going to be tracking methods, past, present, and future. I'm going to be presenting with Bonnie on this as well, so I'm going to be presenting on the past and the future, and she'll be doing the present. Hold on. Sorry, guys. What's going on with this presentation? One sec. Okay, there we go. So basically, some of the earliest forms of tracking were these things called web beacons, which you can basically think of like an image pixel or an iframe. And what they were really made to do was track data back to anywhere that someone wants to track data back to. And it's really just a matter of placing like an image pixel in either an email or a website, so that when that email is opened or the website is loaded, it just simply makes a call back somewhere to a server or somewhere that someone wants to track data. And it's not necessarily tracking specific events like clicks or able to track things back to a specific click or an action beforehand. It's more just tracking that an action happened. So that's really the earliest kind of concept of affiliate tracking in general, is just being able to track those things. And what they were able to do is basically just, first off, they were hosted in the actual website itself. So the link in there was actually sending data back to their own server to actually to analyze what was going on there. And they were just very basic, and they're still used to some degree today, but they're usually actually used with other things like framing or cookies to actually track data back to specific platforms or systems. So that kind of leads me into what framing is. And basically, the big difference between, and what framing kind of opened up the doors for, is it allowed for a third-party system to basically access data that exists on a web page. And that was really key to how we understand tracking now, because essentially what framing allowed people to do was have a bit of code placed that wasn't hosted on the website, it was hosted somewhere else, and it actually could report data back to somewhere outside of the website. And this was really key to opening the doors to a lot of different tracking solutions and platforms, to allow them to not necessarily have to be hosted on the site itself to be able to know what was going on when someone opened an email or really anything that they wanted to track. So the next kind of thing that I want to mention is browser fingerprinting. So this is basically what it is it just takes your browser characteristics, and it basically allows you to match up who this person is based on those things. So it might seem that there are, a lot of people with the same exact browser and characteristics that you have, but it's actually a more effective way to track data than you might assume. There's your specific device characteristics, browser, operating system, screen resolution. Those are really like a 1 in a million type of thing, and especially when you combine that with the other methods of tracking, it actually is quite an accurate solution. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about here is cookies. So these are really allow us to do a lot of the tracking that we do within Everflow. So a cookie is basically a little piece of info that's placed into a website, and it allows us to basically track what's going on when that user goes to a different page, or and the cookies can also be placed not just in the website, but they can also be placed inside the browser themselves, and that allows us to track them from one site to the next site to the next site. So and that's a third-party cookie. So, and I'm going to talk about third-party versus first-party in the next slide a little bit as well. So third-party tracking versus first-party tracking. So I think it's important to understand what third-party is and what first-party is. So first-party is data that's owned by the website, and it's data that exists within the website itself. Whereas third-party tracking and third-party data is data that's basically living somewhere else, and we're basically able to gather that data from a different domain that exists somewhere else or a different server. So that's important to understanding because later on we're going to talk about what's going on with a lot of the restrictions around privacy. And a lot of it has to do with the third-party tracking versus first-party tracking and what people consider when talking about privacy and all of those things when it comes down to browsers. So although many of you might not have used an image pixel in a long time, or even an iframe for that matter, they're actually, what this data kind of proves is how prominent they really are still across the internet. So there's kind of a small sample of websites. And you can see that there's a pretty high percentage of websites that just have an image tag placed on them. And they're pretty much the most obvious categories, like shopping is the number one. Because a lot of the shopping, people obviously want to track what's going on within their shopping cart and within the website where they're selling goods. And a lot of the tracking is done nowadays is done through image tags, which is interesting because really that I think might be the worst way that you can track data back to Everflow in terms of the performance and the amount of discrepancy that you get. So I thought these kind of stats were interesting, and it basically proves the point that that things are slowly moving towards a more effective way to track, but there's still a lot of this kind of old tech that's left over that a lot of people are still using. And I would consider image pixels as a way to track kind of outdated at this point. So moving on to tracking methods, we're going to talk about the present, and Bonnie's going to take over from here.
Hey guys, thanks Pete. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about present tracking methods that you can actually find in Everflow today. So if you want to go to the next slide. Maybe.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thanks. So the methods that you see in Everflow today are cookie-based, server postback, the iframe and image pixel, and then also JavaScript. So I'm going to go into these a little bit, and a few I have some examples of. If you want to go into the next slide. So starting with cookie-based, I'm not going to talk too much about this because Pete covered it a little bit in the beginning, but it is client-side tracking where that code is placed on a web visitor's browser after being generated by another party's website other than your own, and it's actually used to record a conversion. Again, this is still being used, but it is being phased out by 2022, specifically by Chrome, which is the browser that most people use. As well as for cookie-based, if they do have ad blockers for their browsers, then they won't be able to use the cookie-based. The next one is server postback. So this is actually cookieless tracking. So instead of loading on a client side, such as a browser, this is all done via server side and actually creates a server-to-server connection. And that's how you record conversions. So and events, it's actually through a transaction ID or a unique code for each user's click, and then actually returns the successful conversion data. And I'm not going to talk too much about that either because we will get into that a little bit later as well. But we can go to the next slide. So the iframe and the image pixel. It is normally set, the pixel is normally set within a confirmation page, and it actually reports conversions when a sale has occurred. You do not need a transaction ID. This is a little bit about what Pete was saying. But we actually do recommend the transaction ID because if not, it's actually using the cookie as a fallback. So one example of how we see some people using these is actually with Google Tag Manager. So what they'll do is they'll take that postback from Everflow from the offer or from the global postback. And you can actually place this within Google Tag Manager and set your variables and your triggers. And then the Google Tag Manager container code actually goes onto the website. And when a conversion is triggered, say on the thank you page or something like that, it actually posts back to Everflow that conversion. So that is the iframe and image, and you can go to the next slide. Okay, this one is JavaScript. So JavaScript is actually code that's placed within a website, and it's to be fired with a transaction ID or a variable in order for the conversion to be recorded. The examples that I'm going to go through are direct linking and also the coupon code tracking. So before I talk about direct linking, I kind of want to go over a little bit about a traditional partner redirect. So what happens here is that the user actually clicks on the Everflow tracking link. There are encoded values in it already. So when it goes into Everflow, we know, like the offer and the partner. And then it'll send that actual landing page or base destination URL. It actually posts the user to there. But within direct linking, what actually happens is a user clicks on an Everflow link, and it's actually the landing page or the website where the user needs to land. So there are a couple of parameters that are added on, but what essentially is happening here is that the JavaScript click code is added to the main page, and then there's also a conversion code that's added on the thank you page. So the transaction ID is created on the click, it's actually stored in local storage, and then it's passed to the conversion code when, say, the thank you page is loaded, and then it posts back to us that transaction ID. I want to go over, actually, before we leave this page, I do want to say that direct linking seems to improve user experience just by they no longer have that redirect. They can actually see what link they're clicking on and where they're going to, as well as it actually allows partners to promote on channels like Facebook and Google that prohibit the third-party links. So if you want to go to the next example, which would be coupon codes. So coupon codes actually allow for the tracking of a specific partner with a coupon code. So if you wanted to set this up, you would go into Everflow. Say you want to set up a specific coupon code for me, your partner, and you want to name it Bonnie's Deals. So you go in and you create this, and you specify the offer and then me as the partner. You send me this link. You send me this code, Bonnie's Deals, and I say, great. So you then send me the offer that you would like it to be on, and I post it and I say, hey, this is a great offer. Use this coupon code, Bonnie's Deal. So when that coupon code's actually used, a postback is fired into Everflow with that coupon code, and Everflow actually attributes the conversion to the offer and the partner associated with the coupon without using the tracking links. So that is a little bit about coupon codes and what different tracking methods that you can find in Everflow. And Pete's actually now going to talk about the future.
Yep, thanks, Bonnie. So now I'm going to basically talk about the future of tracking methods in general, and a lot of it's going to be based around what we've been seeing and hearing from a lot of what the browsers are doing in terms of restrictions, because essentially server tracking isn't going to be affected by a lot of the things that are going on from a privacy standpoint at the browser level. So kind of get into some of the examples of what's been going on. So Safari really kind of kicked off the privacy conversation that's been going on with browsers with ITP. And basically, to sum up what ITP does, is it was mainly targeted at third-party tracking, which is basically third-party cookies. And a third-party cookie is usually set at the browser level, not within the specific website itself. And these third-party cookies were they were made to essentially track users around the internet and track different things that they're doing. And so that, from a privacy standpoint for Safari and a lot of these other browsers, is kind of an issue for them. So a lot of what they've been kind of putting in place, and they've kind of iterated through ITP and started restricting also first-party data as well, is kind of centered around those kind of privacy concerns that we've been seeing. And that kind of led to also Firefox, I think, doing the same kind of thing with ETP, which is basically, it's a lot like ITP. It's limiting, centered around specifically third-party pixels and third-party cookies that are placed within the browser. And essentially, with Safari and Firefox, I think what you need to be aware of is if you're doing third-party cookie tracking, it's not just going to be a discrepancy problem anymore. It's just not going to work. Like it doesn't work at all for the newest versions of their browsers. It might still work for people that are using older versions of Safari and Firefox, but as more people update, like you're just going to see these, anyone using Safari and Firefox that you're doing third-party cookie tracking with is just not going to work because they're blocking a lot of that stuff. And before I get into Google, I think it's important to mention market share of what these browsers own in terms of market share. Google is the huge kind of winner in terms of market share. They're at about 70%. And then Safari and Firefox, I would say, split anywhere from like 20 to 25. And then the rest is just smaller browsers. So really, if you're not seeing the huge discrepancies right now and you're still doing third-party tracking based off of third-party cookies, then it's likely, it doesn't seem like a big deal right now. But when Google really makes a change and when they start doing things with Chrome to block those third-party cookies, you're going to see a huge influx of issues going on with your tracking discrepancies, things not working the same way. So, and like Bonnie mentioned, that they actually intend on making a lot of these changes within the next 2 years. So really, this slide isn't really meant to scare you, although it kind of is. If you're doing this kind of tracking, it's something to consider in terms of changing the way that you've been thinking about tracking because of these changes, especially when you're handling stuff within the browser itself and kind of relying on them to track data back to Everflow, or really anywhere that you're tracking. I mean, this is going to be a problem across the board. We have done things like Bonnie talked about, the direct linking, where since we have code placed within the site itself, when the user gets to the landing page, we're actually able to place first-party local storage data. So this allows us to essentially get around some of these third-party issues that we're seeing. But really, at the end of the day, it's just a Band-Aid. For the big changes that are going to happen with in the next 2 years, they're going to even target some of that data in terms of tracking. So it's just an uphill battle that you're just going to continue fighting forever if you're doing stuff within a browser to track data back to Everflow, and that's just how it goes. So that kind of brings me to the next slide, which is talking about server-side tracking. So server-side tracking, as Bonnie mentioned, is basically a way to get data to Everflow from one server to our server. And it kind of requires that you send us a specific transaction ID that we produce in our system. You can obviously send also a coupon code, which Bonnie mentioned as well. We allow clickless tracking, and as of right now, like those are kind of the options for server-side tracking. So some of the kind of pros of this are you don't have to obviously rely on browser-side anything. This includes dealing with possible ad blocker issues and those type of things. It also allows for security. So if you're passing data back from a browser and you're actually populating our code that exists in the browser with potentially sensitive data about the user, that data is actually visible. So there could be a security concern there, as well as there are also ways that affiliates can get around some of the things that we have in Everflow that exist as a security to actually stop them from like creating fake conversions. They can, if they're savvy enough, they can get around those things, even if you're doing everything that you can within Everflow to stop that. So handling things from a server really makes it very hard for them to basically attribute fake data to themselves. The other thing that's, it might also improve speed. So when you're relying on browsers, you're relying on a lot of things that go on within the browser, which are speed, internet connection, all of those things that could affect how the code's getting loaded and how data is getting reported back to Everflow. Another thing that's kind of a big one is with server-side integrations, there's no front-end release required. So for example, say you have, you're working with an advertiser and you want them to basically deploy Everflow tracking code on their site. This actually might bog down the process for you for quite a while, depending on how big the brand is and what their restrictions are, and does it have to go through their legal team. There's been a number of situations where a release basically allows like your client to place the code there, kind of restricts the ability and how quickly you can get up and running, which is also a pro of server-side tracking. And then, you can provide IP and geolocation as well through server-side tracking too. It's just a matter of sending it to us. Another thing that is a con of server-side tracking is it actually requires engineering time and effort from either the advertiser's end or your end to actually get it up and working. So, and that's a pretty big con for some people. It requires, you have some kind of engineering team or at least someone that you can have implement this. And that's, I think, the biggest reason why people have not switched to server-side tracking. So, and another thing I wanted to mention was the Facebook marketing API. So this is just a prime example of Facebook allowing people to really start to send data back to, tracking systems from Facebook instead of having forcing people to place code within a browser to do that. And I think that's a really good example of a big company doing this sort of thing, and just proves that things are moving more towards that server-side tracking capability. And I think our advice, and if you want to finish this with one thing, is just start thinking about if you're only doing client-side tracking, which is tracking within a browser, you should start thinking about how to make that switch to server-side, because it's coming within the next couple of years, and you don't want to be kind of in a bad situation when Chrome starts releasing these things. It's going to really stop your business from moving forward until you figure it out, and you don't want to be scrambling. So I think that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions or anything? Let's see, I think there is actually one Q&A. All right, let's see. So when using the tracking method, HTTPS iframe with transaction ID, if a browser has ad block or does not allow third-party cookies, will the pixels still fire if there is a transaction ID passed? So the answer is yes, it will. So as long as that code, as long as there's basically a get call made to that code with transaction ID that exists within it, it doesn't matter if they're blocking all the cookies or all of that stuff. And that's kind of the reason that we give you this. It's a little bit of a hybrid where you can put that code within there and actually still track data back to Everflow. But my advice is, don't even use that if you can help it. Like, you want to switch to server-side tracking if you can. Okay, let's see. I think I might have another question here. Okay, that seems to be it, I believe. Okay, cool. All right, guys, so the next presentation is going to be split testing, smart links, and optimization with Chris and Kristen. And that'll be in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone.